Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Felicia had always believed in structure. Everything in her life was arranged neatly, like the expensive porcelain plates in her glass cabinet, untouched, perfectly aligned, and never out of place. Her marriage to Bashir followed the same order. They had been together for 8 years, and though the passion of their early days had settled into something quieter, more predictable, she took comfort in that stability. Bashir was a responsible man, a quiet provider, the type who didn't waste words on unnecessary conversations. He worked long hours, and when he came home, he expected his meals warm and his house in order. Felicia made sure to meet those expectations, just as she had done since the beginning. It wasn't love wrapped in grand gestures or sweet nothings, but it worked, and that was enough. Or so she thought. Their home was a well-oiled machine, and at the center of its efficiency was Favor. Felicia had brought her from the village 2 years ago, a young girl of 24, who had barely spoken above a whisper when she first arrived. She was quiet, almost too quiet, her presence so unnoticeable that at times it felt as if the house ran itself. Felicia liked that about her. There were no complaints, no unnecessary chatter, no questioning of tasks. Favor did her work efficiently, waking before dawn to clean the house, prepare breakfast, and arrange the day's needs before Felicia even had to ask. She ate last, cleaned up after everyone, and was always the last to go to bed. Felicia saw this as normal. After all, that was the way things had always been. House helps were there to serve, and Favor never protested. In fact, she never seemed to react to anything at all. There was something unsettling about her calmness, but Felicia had never given it much thought. If anything, she was relieved to have someone so obedient, someone who did not add to the weight of her responsibilities. But what Felicia never considered was that silence often hid secrets. She never noticed the small things, how Favor's eyes lingered on Bashir for just a second too long when serving his food, how she moved with a quiet confidence that belied her supposed servitude, or how she never seemed truly tired despite working from dawn till midnight. Felicia was too occupied with keeping her house in order to pay attention to the undercurrents that swirled around her. She assumed everything was exactly as it should be, but assumptions had a way of breaking apart when least expected, and in Felicia's world, the cracks had already begun to form, even if she couldn't see them yet. Favor was unlike any house help Felicia had ever employed. The others before her had been clumsy, chatty, or simply inefficient, always requiring supervision and endless reminders. But Favor was different. From the very first day, she moved through the house with an uncanny sense of awareness, as if she had memorized the spaces before even stepping foot in them. She never needed to be told twice, never forgot a task, never sighed in exhaustion or frowned in displeasure. If she was tired, she never showed it. If she was unhappy, she never let it slip. She was simply there, always present, always working, always quiet. Felicia assumed she was just grateful to have a place to stay, to have food to eat, and to escape the struggles of the village life she had come from. But there were moments, fleeting and strange, when Felicia would catch her watching, her dark eyes calm yet unreadable, as if she was studying something far beyond the walls of the house she lived in. Those moments were so brief, so insignificant, that Felicia dismissed them almost as soon as they happened. Unlike the past house helps, Favor never asked for anything, not extra food, not new clothes, not even an occasional afternoon off. She accepted what was given to her with quiet obedience, never expressing preferences or desires. Felicia found it convenient, never once questioning why a young woman would have no personal wants, no moments of rebellion or complaint. Even when Felicia made sure she was the last to eat, even when she assigned her the most tiring chores, Favor never flinched. If there was resentment buried inside her, she kept it well hidden, masking it behind a composed expression and a steady, unfaltering demeanor. Yet, for all her calmness, there was something almost unnatural about the way she carried herself, as though she was waiting for something. It wasn't the meekness of a desperate servant. It was something else entirely, something harder to define. Felicia was too caught up in the comfort of a well-run household to dwell on the unease that occasionally brushed against her thoughts. Bashir, on the other hand, had noticed favor in a way Felicia never had. Felicia had always assumed that her husband had no interest in anything beyond his work, his food, and his routine. But men like Bashir did not need to show their intentions openly. They noticed things in silence, acted in shadows. He was a man of few words, but words were never necessary for desires to grow. And favor, with her quiet grace, her unwavering obedience, and her unfathomable stillness, was impossible to ignore. Unlike Felicia, who was occupied with ensuring the house remained in order, Bashir had the luxury of watching. And he did watch. More than Felicia ever knew, more than she could have ever imagined. Felicia was not a cruel woman, nor was she intentionally unkind. She simply believed in structure, in hierarchy. In her mind, favor was a house help, someone beneath the family, someone whose purpose was to serve. And in that belief, she overlooked the little ways in which she made favor feel small. It wasn't outright mistreatment, nothing so obvious that an outsider would call it cruelty. It was in the way she never once asked favor if she was tired after a long day, in how she placed her needs, her comfort, her authority above favor's existence without a second thought. Meals were served in order of importance, Bashir first, then herself, then the children, and finally, favor. If there was extra food, she could eat until she was full. If there wasn't, she simply had to make do. It had always been this way, and favor never complained, never asked for more. Felicia saw no problem in it. And when the day ended, when everyone had gone to bed, she never once considered how it must feel to be the last one standing, to watch the lights go out in rooms that were never hers, to clean up after a family that never truly saw her. What Felicia failed to notice, what she refused to notice, was the way Bashir had begun to see favor differently. It started with small things. He never called her by name in front of Felicia, but there was a difference in his tone when he addressed her directly. It was not the sharp, dismissive way he spoke to workers at the office or the distant tone he used with Felicia on nights when he was too tired to make conversation. It was something softer, something Felicia would have picked up on if she had been paying attention. When Favor walked past him in the corridor, his gaze lingered, not long enough to be obvious, but just enough to be telling. When she set his plate before him, his eyes followed her hands, his expression unreadable. He was not a man given to outward affection, and so his interest was subtle, creeping into the quiet spaces where Felicia was not looking. And Favor, calm, watchful Favor, noticed it. How could she not? The way he sometimes spoke lowly to her, as if his words were only meant for her ears. The way he looked at her when he thought no one was paying attention. She never reacted, never broke her careful composure. But she knew. She had always known. Felicia was blind to it all, too wrapped up in the routines of her home, too confident in the belief that her husband would never look elsewhere. She had grown accustomed to his silence, his lack of warmth, accepting it as the natural state of a long marriage. She did not ask for more, and so she assumed he did not need more. She never questioned why he spent more time at work, why he came home later than before, or why, on some nights, he simply sat in the living room long after she had gone to bed. She mistook his distance for exhaustion, his disinterest for routine. And so, when Favor moved through the house, quiet and obedient as ever, Felicia did not see the danger that lived in her silence. She did not see the slow unraveling of something she had spent years believing was secure. She did not know that in the corners of her home, in the pauses between words and the quiet moments of observation, a betrayal was already beginning to take shape. Bashir had never been an expressive man, and Felicia had grown used to the quiet spaces between them. In the early years of their marriage, she had tried to fill those spaces, asking him how his day went, planning small surprises, making an effort to draw him into conversations. But over time, his responses had become shorter, his attention elsewhere, and eventually Felicia had stopped trying. She convinced herself that this was normal, that marriage wasn't about endless conversation or grand displays of affection. It was about companionship, about building a life together, even in silence. So when Bashir's routine started to shift, when he began coming home later than usual, spending longer hours in the study, or sitting in the car for a few extra minutes before stepping into the house, Felicia didn't immediately question it. She chalked it up to stress, to work demands, to the quiet fatigue that came with responsibility. She had no reason to suspect otherwise. After all, there had been no fights, no accusations, no warnings. Their life together was steady, uneventful, predictable, and in her mind, predictability meant security. But predictability had also made her blind. What she failed to see was how Bashir's restlessness was not the kind that came from work pressure or financial burdens. It was deeper, more personal, more urgent. He had started avoiding the bedroom more often, retreating into long showers, finding reasons to stay up late. When Felicia reached for him at night, he would pull away under the guise of exhaustion, turning his back before she could question his distance. When they did speak, his answers were clipped, his patience thin, as though even the simplest interactions had become a burden. Yet, despite his coldness towards her, there was an energy in him that hadn't been there before, a quiet hunger lurking beneath his detached exterior. Felicia noticed it in the way his gaze often drifted past her, as if searching for something she couldn't give him. It was in the way he sat at the dinner table, barely touching his food, his thoughts elsewhere. But most of all, it was in the way he had begun to linger in spaces where favor moved. She never saw them alone together, never had any reason to suspect an actual affair, but there was something about the way Bashir's presence seemed to shift when favor was in the room. A tension, a silent awareness, like an unspoken language passing between them. Favor, as always, remained unreadable. She moved through the house with the same quiet efficiency, her expression never betraying anything more than what was necessary. But there were small things, so small that Felicia only noticed them in fleeting moments. The way favor never met her eyes for too long. The way she responded to Bashir's presence with the same unwavering calm, never flustered, never unsure. There was no hesitation in her movements, no trace of the nervousness one would expect from a househelp around her employer. It was as though she knew something Felicia did not, something that gave her an upper hand in a game Felicia wasn't even aware was being played. And yet Felicia still did not suspect. She saw Bashir's distance, but did not connect it to favor. She felt the tension in the house, but assumed it was temporary. She sensed the shift in the air, but did not think to ask why. She was too caught up in the belief that silence meant peace, too confident that the life she had built could not be touched. But peace built on ignorance was nothing more than an illusion, and illusions had a way of shattering when least expected. Felicia woke up to an eerie stillness in the house. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of dawn, where the world still stretched itself awake. It was different, almost unnatural. Something was missing. She pushed aside the covers and stepped into the hallway, listening. The house always had its own rhythm, a familiar sequence of sounds that had become a part of her mornings. She should have heard the faint clinking of plates from the kitchen, the gentle shuffle of favor moving about before anyone else had stirred. But there was nothing. The air felt strangely hollow, as if a presence had been lifted from the space. Frowning, she made her way to the small room at the back of the house, where Favor slept. The door was slightly ajar, the bed neatly made. Everything was in its place, except Favor. A sense of unease crawled over her skin as she stepped inside. There was no suitcase, no scattered belongings, nothing to suggest a hurried departure. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. Felicia felt no immediate concern, no real loss. Favor was just a house help. If she had left, it was her own decision. Felicia even felt a slight annoyance at the inconvenience of it all. There had been no warning, no resignation, no explanation. She hadn't even waited for her wages. Ungrateful, Felicia muttered under her breath as she walked back to the bedroom where Bashir was just stirring. She barely gave him time to wake fully before she announced, "Favor has run away." She expected a grunt of acknowledgement, maybe mild irritation at having to find someone new. Instead, Bashir remained silent, sitting up slowly, his face unreadable. Felicia waited for a reaction, but there was none. No questions, no surprise. He simply got out of bed, walked into the bathroom, and shut the door behind him. Something about his indifference unsettled her, but she dismissed it just as quickly. Perhaps, like her, he saw Favor's departure as nothing more than an inconvenience. But something lingered in the days that followed, an unspoken weight that Felicia couldn't quite place. Bashir seemed more distant than ever, his presence growing fainter even when he was in the same room. He avoided conversation, his replies shorter than before, his mind elsewhere. Felicia attributed it to stress, convinced herself that work was pressing on him harder than usual. She did not see the storm gathering around her. A week passed, and just as quietly as Favor had disappeared, Bashir followed. There was no note, no goodbye, not even the echo of an argument that could explain his absence. He was simply gone. His phone rang endlessly without an answer. His office had no idea where he was. Felicia's world, so carefully structured, so perfectly predictable, had suddenly unraveled before her eyes. And for the first time, a cold, gnawing fear gripped her, one that whispered that this was no ordinary disappearance. Something was very, very wrong. The house felt different without Bashir. It wasn't just the absence of his physical presence, it was the emptiness he left behind, the way his absence seemed to stretch into every room, filling every corner with unanswered questions. Felicia refused to believe he had truly left. Men like Bashir didn't just disappear. He was responsible, predictable, steady. Even in his distance and his silence, he had always been present. She convinced herself that something urgent had come up, an emergency, a work trip, something he simply hadn't had the chance to explain. But as the days turned into a week, and the week threatened to turn into something longer, doubt began to gnaw at her carefully constructed logic. She called his phone over and over, each unanswered ring pressing against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake off. At night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening for the familiar sound of his key in the lock, for his heavy footsteps in the hallway. But the house remained silent. She tried to keep herself busy. There were still chores to be done, meals to prepare, routines to follow. But without Favor, the work was heavier, and without Bashir, the purpose felt thinner. The children noticed the shift in the air. They asked where their father had gone, why he wasn't answering calls. Felicia gave them the same reassurances she gave herself, that he would be back soon, that there was nothing to worry about. But even as she said the words, they felt hollow. Something was wrong, though she couldn't name it. She went to the police, filed a report, answered their questions. Had he been acting differently? No. Had they fought recently? No. Did she suspect foul play? No. Each question felt like a reflection of her own growing unease, a reminder of how little she actually knew about the man she had lived with for 8 years. The officers were polite but unconcerned. Men went missing all the time, they told her. Sometimes they needed space. Sometimes they had secrets. Sometimes they had another life entirely. The possibility of that last thought lingered in her mind like a sickness she couldn't shake. Another life. It was absurd. Bashir wasn't the kind of man to have affairs, to make reckless choices. But then, hadn't she believed he wasn't the kind of man to disappear either? The more she tried to push the thought away, the more it grew. And then, one afternoon, as she scrolled mindlessly through her phone, her heart suddenly stopped. There, on her screen, was an image she could not mistake. A wedding announcement. The groom, her husband. The bride, favor. The world seemed to tilt beneath her. Her breath came in short gasps as she stared at the picture, at the smiles on their faces, at the undeniable reality staring back at her. The truth had been right in front of her all along, and she had been too blind to see it. Felicia's fingers trembled as she gripped her phone, her eyes refusing to move away from the screen. The image was clear, too sharp, too real. Bashir stood tall in a crisp white caftan, his expression relaxed, even pleased. Beside him, dressed in soft lace with a modest smile, was Favor. They looked right, as if they belonged together. As if they had not just ripped apart the life Felicia had built with one swift, cruel betrayal. Her breath came in shallow bursts as her mind struggled to accept what was right in front of her. How? When? Why? The questions clashed violently in her head, but no answer could make sense of what she was seeing. She had lived under the same roof with this girl, given her food, a place to stay, trusted her. And Bashir, her husband, the man she had built a life with, the man she had assumed was incapable of such deception, had stood beside her all these years, all while planning his escape into another woman's arms. She felt her stomach twist as rage crawled up her throat, thick and suffocating. How long had this been happening? Was it before Favor disappeared? Before Bashir started pulling away? Had there been stolen glances she had been too distracted to notice? Had Favor been waiting for the right moment to strike, slowly making herself indispensable, earning trust, playing a long game that Felicia hadn't even realized she was a part of? The betrayal wasn't just in the act, it was in the planning, the careful deception, the knowledge that they had both looked her in the eye day after day, pretending, lying, waiting. And she had let them. She had been so focused on maintaining order, on keeping things running smoothly, that she had not stopped to see the cracks forming beneath her feet. A bitter laugh forced its way out of her mouth, a sound so hollow it startled even her. What a fool she had been. Her hands tightened around her phone as she pressed the call button, her pulse hammering with each unanswered ring. And then, just as she was about to hang up, the line connected. A pause, a breath, and then his voice, steady, unaffected, as if nothing had happened. Felicia, he said, her name rolling off his tongue with infuriating ease. The sound of it sent a fresh wave of anger through her. She forced the words out, her voice a mix of shock and fury. Why? The silence stretched thick and heavy. Then, finally, his response came, calm, unbothered. I got her pregnant, he said, as if it was a simple truth, as if it explained everything. You refuse to satisfy me as my wife. The words landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. And then, just like that, the call ended. The screen went dark. The silence around her deepened. And for the first time since Bashir had disappeared, Felicia realized he had never truly been hers to begin with. Felicia sat frozen, the weight of Bashir's words pressing against her chest like a force she couldn't shake off. The room around her blurred, its familiar edges suddenly foreign, unfamiliar. Her mind kept circling back to the last thing he had said, you refuse to satisfy me as my wife. It played over and over, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. Was this really what it had come down to? Had her worth, her place in his life, been reduced to nothing more than what she could offer him in bed? The thought sent a shudder through her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand a better answer, a real explanation, but the call had ended, leaving her with nothing but silence. She stared at her reflection in the darkened screen of her phone, searching for something, some flaw, some failure, that could justify the betrayal. But she found nothing. She had been a good wife. She had kept their home in order, raised their children, stayed loyal despite his growing distance. And yet, in the end, it hadn't been enough. The anger simmering inside her twisted into something uglier, a deep, aching humiliation. Everyone would know. It wasn't just the betrayal itself that burned, it was the public nature of it. This wasn't a quiet affair hidden behind closed doors, whispered about in hushed tones. No, this was a wedding, an announcement, a declaration. Bashir had not just left, he had replaced her, and he had done it so boldly, so unapologetically, that it made her question if she had ever truly mattered to him at all. Had he been planning this for months? Years? Had he looked at her every day, knowing he would leave, and still let her believe they were building a life together? The thought made her stomach churn. She had trusted him. She had trusted favor. And now they stood side by side, united in their betrayal, while she sat alone in the ruins of what she had thought was her marriage. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying would not change anything. It would not bring Bashir back, would not erase the pain, would not undo the public humiliation she was about to face. Instead, a cold, steely resolve began to settle in her chest. She would not be reduced to a pitiful, abandoned wife. If Bashir thought he could walk away so easily, if he believed he could discard her without consequences, he was wrong. She wasn't sure what she would do yet, how she would reclaim her dignity, how she would even begin to move forward. But one thing was certain, she would not crumble. Not for him. Not for favor. Not for anyone. Slowly, she stood, squaring her shoulders, forcing the ache in her chest into something sharper. He had taken so much from her, but she would not let him take her strength. The house felt colder now, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with space. The absence of Bashir was no longer just an emotional wound. It had become something tangible, something that seeped into the walls, the air, the very foundation of what had once been a home. Felicia moved through the house with a stiffness she had never known before, as if she were a guest in her own life, trying to navigate the remnants of what had been left behind. The furniture was the same. The pictures on the walls remained untouched. The plates were still neatly stacked in the cabinets, and yet everything felt wrong. The house no longer belonged to a family, it belonged to memories, to ghosts of a life that had unraveled before her eyes. She caught herself listening for Bashir's footsteps at odd moments, expecting his deep voice to break the silence. But there was nothing, only the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet. The children had questions she had no answers for. When is Daddy coming back? Why won't he answer? Did we do something wrong? She tried to reassure them with empty words, but even as she spoke, she could see the doubt creeping into their young eyes. They weren't fools. They could sense the shift, the way the house no longer carried the same warmth. Her youngest had started sleeping in her bed, curling into her side at night, seeking a comfort that she wasn't sure she had left to give. Felicia hated Bashir for this, for what he had done not just to her but to the children. He hadn't just walked away from a wife, he had walked away from a family, from the very people who had loved him without conditions. And he had done it so effortlessly, as if shedding one life to step into another was the easiest thing in the world. She wondered if he ever thought of them, if he ever lay awake at night feeling even an ounce of regret. But she knew the answer before the question had fully formed. He had made his choice, and he had made it without hesitation. Felicia tried to move forward, but it was impossible to ignore the whispers, the pitying glances from neighbors and acquaintances who had seen the wedding announcement. They spoke in hushed voices, casting sympathetic looks her way, as if she was something fragile, something broken. The shame burned, creeping into her skin like a stain she could not wash off. She didn't want their pity. She didn't want their murmured condolences, their subtle avoidance of her gaze. But the worst part was knowing that no matter how strong she tried to appear, the betrayal had left a mark on her, one that would not fade easily. It was in the way she hesitated before stepping out of the house, and the way she flinched whenever she heard Bashir's name, and the way her hands trembled when she saw a message notification, only to find it wasn't him. She was trapped in the ruins of what he had left behind, forced to navigate a life that suddenly felt like a stranger's. And for the first time, she realized moving on wasn't just about forgetting. It was about learning to exist in the wreckage, even when every part of her wanted to collapse. Felicia had always believed that time healed wounds, but now she realized that some wounds never truly faded. They simply became part of the skin, woven into the very fabric of a person's existence. The days passed in a blur, yet each one felt painfully slow, dragging her through the weight of her own emotions. The mornings were the worst. Waking up to the quiet, to the space beside her that would never be filled by Bashir again, was a cruel reminder of how much her world had changed. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the ache in her chest settle deeper, heavier. But there was no time to wallow. The children still needed her. The house still needed to be kept. Life refused to pause simply because hers had shattered. So she forced herself up, forced herself to function, even as exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. She cooked breakfast with mechanical precision, answered the children's questions with careful neutrality, and smiled when necessary, even when it felt like a lie. As the weeks turned into months, she began to notice the subtle ways in which she was changing. The woman who had once found comfort in structure and the predictability of routine was now learning to embrace uncertainty. She stopped waiting for Bashir's call. She no longer checked her phone with the same desperate hope. The pain was still there, lingering beneath the surface, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, it became something she carried with quiet strength, something that shaped her rather than consumed her. She had started making small decisions for herself, things she had never thought twice about before. She rearranged the living room, removing the couch Bashir had loved so much. She cut her hair shorter, as if shedding the weight of the past with every strand that fell. She even considered looking for a job, something she had never needed to do before. For so long, she had defined herself as a wife, as a mother, as someone who belonged to a unit. But now, for the first time in years, she was learning how to belong to herself. The whispers in the neighborhood slowly faded, replaced by something else, respect. People had expected her to crumble, to disappear into her grief, but she had refused to be reduced to a tragedy. She walked with her head high, not because she had forgotten, but because she refused to be weighed down by what had been done to her. There were still moments of weakness, nights where the loneliness felt unbearable, but she no longer saw herself as broken. She was scarred, yes, but scars told stories of survival. And she had survived. One evening, as she stood on the porch watching the sky darken, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The past would always be a part of her, but it would not define her future. And for the first time since Bashir had left, she allowed herself to imagine what came next. Not as a wife, not as a woman abandoned, but as Felicia, whole, strong, and enough. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.